Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. Given the plethora of conflicting and confusing reports, we ask today, what is the true state of the Indian economy? Do we have cause for concern or do we have grounds for cheer? That's the key issue I shall put today to the former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission and presently a distinguished fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Mr. Ahluwalia, I want to initially talk to you about three disturbing developments in the economy before I broaden out and ask what they suggest about the situation we presently face and also what they suggest about the future. Now, first, the recently released Q1 results show that today private consumption has not only fallen 12% below pre-pandemic levels, but it's actually collapsed all the way to what it was in 2017-18. And that means private consumption has regressed 4 full years. Given that private consumption constitutes 56% of the Indian economy and is therefore by far the single biggest engine driving the economy, how bad is this news?
It's certainly a problem. As you say, consumption is the largest single component on the demand side. And if it has fallen as it has below the level even 2 or 3 years ago, it's difficult to imagine the economy will be able to achieve a recovery without a recovery in consumption. It wouldn't be such a problem if the decline in consumption was offset by a big increase in investment. I mean, that would present different kinds of problems, but overall aggregate demand would support a higher growth rate. But investment is in just as bad a situation. So I think we have a problem of lack of demand to get back to the kind of recovery that we really need. Now, how much this will ease in the course of the year is a little more difficult to predict. But I think that's the main reason why growth in the current year is not going to be what was initially announced when the budget was put out, something like 11%. It's going to be much lower in real terms.
In fact, surveys suggest that the situation is not going to improve in anything like a hurry. First of all, surveys done by the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy show that consumer sentiment has fallen at the end of August 44% compared to its level in March 2020. So although newspapers are reporting upticks in things like electricity consumption, car sales, GST receipts, and even foreign exchange reserves, if consumer sentiment has fallen so sharply, clearly demand is not going to pick up. And if demand doesn't pick up, private consumption is not going to improve. So this does suggest that the problem is going to continue for quite a while, doesn't it?
It's a reasonable position that you're taking. You know, you have to remember that private consumption sentiment, to some extent, reflects how the decline of income has affected large numbers of people. So we're currently in a situation where the largest number of consumers are really in the informal sector, not the ones in the formal sector. And their incomes have been hurt much more than the overall GDP. That's the first point. So they don't see an immediate recovery for the informal sector. That's point number one. Point number two is even those who are in the formal sector, who may not actually have experienced a big decline in income, they're experiencing a lot of uncertainty. They're not sure whether the jobs they have are going to stay. And that uncertainty will continue until the economy looks well set on a rapid recovery path. And I think until that happens, you can expect that people will hold back, even the ones who have spending power will hold back until the future looks a little clearer.
In fact, just to give a bit more detail to the audience, as you point out, income is critical to consumer sentiment, which in turn is critical to private consumption. But once again, surveys done by the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy show that 41.5% of households believe that their incomes will actually worsen over the next 12 months. And a further 50% firmly believe they're not going to see any improvement in income. So these people are not going to spend, therefore they will not create demand, and therefore that problem with private consumption, which is grim, will either continue to stay grim or it has at least the potential to get worse.
Well, to some extent, the very negative assessment which you mentioned reflects the fact that the second wave of the COVID epidemic struck pretty much during the first quarter of the current year. And so people who thought that perhaps the COVID wave had abated suddenly found that it hadn't. So that would have led to a big writing down of consumer sentiment. Now, if it turns out that this sentiment can change, I mean, if it turns out in the next 6 months or the next 3 months even, that the third wave that everyone's talking about is not really that strong. That's point number one. Point number two is if the pickup in the economy actually accelerates, because it needs to accelerate. We're not even back to 2019-20 levels for most sectors right now. You can see a change of sentiment. But it's going to change only because these things happen. It's not going to change because you just tell people to be more optimistic. And we have to see how the economy behaves in the next 3 months or so.
Absolutely. A change in sentiment is dependent upon the sort of third wave we have, if we have a third wave. And as yet, we don't know the answer to that. And secondly, a change in sentiment is dependent upon the economy picking up. But at the moment, the economy is not picking up sufficiently to change sentiment. And that particular one could become a circular thing. Let me at this point raise what I call the second disturbing development. And this is a sort of paradoxical one because prima facie, it looks like good news, but actually when you dig deeper, it's not. There's been a fairly remarkable and sharp increase in the share of employment in agriculture. It's gone up from 42.5% in 2018-19 to 45.6% in 2019-20. And on the surface, this looks as if employment is growing. But when you realize that agriculture is in fact an employer of last resort, this then becomes distress employment, and these are people who've lost better paying jobs and literally fallen back on agriculture to keep body and soul together.
I think that's absolutely correct. You know, the benchmark of good performance should be a further decline in employment in agriculture. I mean, a successful economy at our stage of development is one which is generating enough non-agricultural employment to pull people out of low-wage agricultural employment. Ideally, it should be good quality non-agricultural employment. But, you know, in the past, it hasn't actually been good quality, but it has been non-agricultural and at higher wages than what they get in agriculture. What you see now is with the collapse of that particular boom in the non-agricultural areas, people have moved back into agriculture and taking whatever jobs they can at whatever remuneration they get. So I don't think the growth of agricultural employment should be counted as a positive at all. In fact, if you look at the available data, there's lots of evidence that, you know, the structure of employment has somewhat deteriorated. And we don't have enough information on wages. But see, the key thing is there's no merit in the growth of employment at very low wages. I mean, people are forced to take those jobs because they have to keep body and soul together. What you want is the kind of high wage employment and ideally high wage with a degree of social security. Now that last part we haven't had for some time. But you know, during the high growth period of 2004 to 2011, we saw for the first time a decline in agricultural employment, and that was a positive development. That has now been reversed.
And in fact, the reversal is a worrying concern, but when you look deeper, you realize something else. The surge in agricultural employment has actually happened in the classification and sector of unpaid family workers. That has gone up from 25.7% to 29.7%, an astonishing 4-point increase, which means that this surge in agricultural employment is almost entirely unpaid family workers. These are not people earning a good salary if they're earning a salary at all. And that adds to one's concern, doesn't it?
Yeah. And many of them are women, actually. A lot of the increase in women's employment is in the form of unpaid family workers. There's another side to it, and that is that this is a reflection of the fact that these very enterprises are hiring less labor than they otherwise would because of the economic distress. I mean, in prosperous times, they were hiring labor to do the difficult work, and the women who either for social or cultural reasons, were not actually working, were simply sort of out of the labor force. They can't hire these workers for economic reasons, so they're relying more on family labor. This is not something to celebrate at all.
In fact, you make a very important point. In good times, when agricultural employment would go up, it would be people who were hired and given good salaries. Now,
Yeah.
unpaid family members are doing that work. And therefore, on paper, the numbers employed in agriculture may be going up, but they're not earning incomes at all. And you mentioned women in particular. And in fact, once again, the statistics show a deep concern. The number of rural women employed in agriculture has risen from 71.1% in 2018-19 to 75.7% in 2019-20. But all of them turn out to be unpaid family workers. So this is distress. This is employment of distress. It's not an indication that women are breaking free of cultural bonds and finding jobs. This is clear distress and nothing else.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, we have a problem with not enough women, not a high enough labor participation rate for women, not enough employment for women. But this is not the way to solve that problem. And this is really nothing but an indication of distress.
Let me then come to the third disturbing development. And in a sense, it ties up everything we're talking about. There's been a very large number of people during the 18 months of the pandemic who've actually fallen below the poverty line. A survey done by Pew suggests the figure is as high as 75 million. Azim Premji University, who uses different calculations, says it's an astonishing 230 million. And if the Azim Premji figure turns out to be closer to correct, doesn't that suggest that all the good work done during the UPA years, when you were deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, to pull people beyond the poverty line and out of poverty, that good work has effectively been reversed?
Yeah, I don't want to claim credit for what was done because I was deputy chairman, but all the good performance of the economy during the UPA years did get reflected in a big increase in the number of people pulled out of poverty. I think 140 million people pulled out of poverty between 2004 and 2011, based on the latest available official poverty line. Now, you know, what has happened is we had another, this is based on the consumer survey. We had another consumer survey done by the NSS in 2017-18. Now, that consumer survey showed that real consumption had declined by 20%. This is in 2017-18, by the way, well before the pandemic, compared to what it was in 2011-12. Now, any such decline would automatically have meant that, you know, the percentages below the poverty line would go up. The government did not release that consumer survey on the grounds that there were some problems with the data, and they were going to do another consumer survey, and I think that's going to start this year. So comparable data with the last consumer survey, we have to wait for this particular year, although leaked information that appeared in the press did point to the fact that poverty would have increased significantly under the previous consumer survey, even before the pandemic. Now, what I think the Azim Premji university study has done is they've taken a totally different basis for classifying people below the poverty line, and that is the minimum wage, both urban and rural. That's not strictly comparable, but what they say is if you use that, then compared to pre-pandemic, maybe 200 plus million people have gone above the poverty line, have gone below the poverty line. And you can't compare these two numbers, and I don't know, for example, what the Azim Premji method would have shown if you used it on the earlier years. But I wouldn't be surprised at all that if you have a huge decline in GDP of the kind we've had, combined with a disproportionate negative effect on the informal sector, that the weaker sections of the population would experience a significant decline in income and therefore also of consumption. So whichever way you measure it, poverty would certainly have gone up. Whether the Pew report is correct or they are correct, I can't say.
Let's get out of this problem of which methodology is the better one or the correct one. Let me put to you a conclusion that is suggested by both Pew and Azim Premji. There's been a phenomenal increase in poverty, because a very sizable number of people have fallen below the poverty line. And that sizable number could be possibly 100 million, which is huge. Would you agree with that way of putting it?
Yes, I would agree. I mean, let me say, it's not a surprise when you have a GDP drop of almost 8% of GDP. 8%, we've never had such a drop before. Compared to earlier years when you were getting growth rates of 7 and 8%, it's not a surprise at all that somebody bears the brunt of this, and therefore people around the poverty line get pushed below it. Exact numbers we can dispute, but 100 million would not surprise me. The other side of that same coin is that as and when the economy recovers in real terms, they would then go back above the poverty line. So this is not necessarily a permanent deterioration. The question is, how is the economy going to recover and over what period? And frankly, that's what we should focus on.
I'll come to that in a moment's time. But first, let's tie up what we have, in a sense, learned from what I call the three disturbing developments. They are a collapse in private consumption, a huge increase in distress employment in agriculture, and a very sizable number, perhaps as many as 100 million, who've actually fallen below the poverty line. If you take the three together, what does it tell you about the state of the economy? And what does that tell you about the state of the country today?
Well, what it tells you about the state of the economy is that we fell into a pit. It's not that we fell into a pit during the pandemic based on healthy growth before. Because the growth rate, I do keep coming back to the growth rate because there's a tendency to focus on all these other things and kind of assume that we can solve those problems without solving the growth rate problem. We can do things to ameliorate those problems, but it's not easy to offset the effect on growth or effect of growth on these things. So clearly what this tells me is that we reached the bottom in the year 2021. We're clawing our way up to the top. I have a feeling that the government exaggerated the space at which this would occur. I mean, at the time of the budget, the projected growth rate was about 11% plus. More likely, it's going to end up being 8%. Some people say a little more. So the question really is, are we going to get there during this year? The chances are that by the end of this year, we will be more or less back to 2019-20, having lost effectively 2 years of growth. The second question to ask is, what happens after that, after we get back to sort of square one? I mean, that's when private business begins to think about investment, because the capacity is now getting to be what is likely to be utilized, and you need to think about the future. Now, if we simply go back to the rather tepid growth rate of 4 to 5% with which we entered the pandemic, that will be no good at all. It will do very little for employment. And we know from the past that the benefits trickling down to the poor build up only after the growth rate goes above 5% to 7, 8% or so. So the state of the economy at the moment, I think, it is recovering. We should be very clear about that. It's probably not recovering as fast as some of the official statements have projected. It's uncertain what the post-recovery growth will be. And that's the biggest challenge, how to make it more than the pre-pandemic recovery. Our problem is not just the pandemic, because we had problems even before the pandemic, and we need to be able to correct those problems.
In fact, the point you're making is critical. And basically, the point is we need to ensure a rate of growth when we get back to pre-pandemic levels that is considerably better than the 4% that we had when we entered the pandemic, because otherwise we don't stand a chance of recovering and making up for the 2 years of lost growth. We may get back to pandemic levels by the end of this financial year, as the government claims. That still won't compensate for 2 years of lost growth. That compensation can only happen if we begin to accelerate growth back to 6 and 7% levels.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. I mean, that's the experience around the world. I mean, the United States, for example, appears to have accelerated very markedly and has more or less got back to its pre-growth, not just growth rate, but the pre-growth GDP trajectory. That's not happened in most developing countries. I mean, everybody's got problems. We have to focus on what we can do, but the target should be, what's the post-pandemic growth rate going to be? And that's an open question.
Let me raise another concern. This time it is to do with private investment, which is officially called gross fixed capital formation. Now, this used to be 10 years ago at levels of 35%. It slipped below 30, and now it tends to hover around 27, 28. How do we ensure this goes back to those 33, 34, 35% levels? Because if that doesn't happen, you're not going to get back to 7 and 8% levels of growth. And if you don't get back to 7, 8% levels of growth, you'll never make up for the 2 years of lost growth. That will be a millstone around your neck forever.
I think that's absolutely correct. If you're looking forward, there are many things you have to do, but in the macroeconomics, it's totally clear that with 26, 27% gross fixed capital formation, which most ordinary people think of as investment, that's just not good enough. During a high growth period, when growth was sort of 8% or so, this number had got to about 34, 35%. If it's declined to about, say, 27%, that's a huge decline of 7 percentage points. That knocks at least 2 percentage points off the growth potential, and that has to be brought back. Now, how do we do it? Well, it has to be a combination, clearly, of better efforts at reviving private investment, and probably in the meantime, I mean, because private investment is going to start recovering when the economy actually shows signs of dynamism. How do you get that going? There is a role for investment even there. And that role perhaps is more in the area of public investment. Public investment here doesn't necessarily mean only from the budgets. It could mean from some of our public sector corporations. We need to put in place a few years of accelerated public investment in the building of infrastructure. I'm not a great votary of the public sector getting into commodity production. But the truth is, our infrastructure is way below what it needs to be if we want to move to a trajectory of 7 to 8% growth over the next 5 or 6 years. And during a period when private investment is a bit depressed, which it is, and is not going to recover very quickly either, except some of the top corporations are now going into the investments in the green economy because they're thinking long term. The government could also do the same thing. I mean, investments in the green economy are absolutely essential for any kind of sensible strategy for managing climate change. So I would say the next 2 or 3 years, the government should put in place a strategy which supports the private investment getting into these areas where we desperately need action.
The government proposes to do that through its monetization program, the National Monetization Program. I want to ask you a simple question. Is that the best way of raising money? Or do you think the charge made by the opposition, this is selling the family silver, actually holds?
Well, I have always been in favor of realizing public resources by disinvestment, as it used to be called then. It's now being called monetization, another word for the same thing, providing you're putting this money into productive assets. So this is like selling family silver to buy some more family silver. I mean, I would not be in favor of this if the idea was to finance a huge increase through the normal process. But if you're using some money realized through this process in order to finance more infrastructure, I think that's not a bad idea at all. The question is, how do you do it? And this is where the debate is. People question whether it will be done transparently, will it be captured by cronies? I think you have to address those issues by a very frank discussion, public discussion of how we're going to prevent these problems from coming up. And transparency is the way to go.
If I understand correctly, monetization of assets is, you believe, a sensible way of raising resources, provided it's invested in necessary and needed infrastructure. The problem is you have to ensure that the monetization is done properly so that it doesn't lead to crony benefits and it doesn't lead to other forms of corruption. So it's not the idea and concept of monetization that you have concerns about. You actually believe it may be the right way, but the handling of it is critical, and we need to have further details from the government, which we don't, about how it will be handled.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, frankly, I think what we have at the moment is a very long-term plan put out by Niti Aayog for monetization over the next 5 or 6 year period. I think what we need is a very early decision that these are the 5 or 6 assets that the government seriously intends to monetize, an early revelation of the terms of that monetization. And terms can vary quite a bit. There are many different ways of doing it. Upfront payments, a combination of upfront payments plus continuous payments, a combination of upfront payments plus revenue share. Each one of these has pros and cons. The terms that will be used to determine who is eligible. Are you going to allow foreign investors into this or not? All of this should be clarified, and it could vary depending on the asset. But this should be put out very quickly so that there can be an intelligent debate. Otherwise, we'll just be discussing the family silver.
Absolutely. Now, this is a process that no one in India believes is going to happen overnight. It could take 3, 4, 5 months, and therefore the impact on the economy may not be for another year. It's a good idea, but the process itself and the clarification and then putting it into motion will take time. Meanwhile, you still have a problem of collapsed private consumption. And until private consumption improves, private investment is not going to happen because investors are not going to want to invest. A, they've got excess capacity anyway, and B, they're not going to want to invest in further capacity because demand is down. So if Mr. Modi were to pick up the phone, and I don't mean this as a trick or trap question, but if he were to pick up the phone and say, Montek, we are pursuing monetization. We will make clear how we plan to do it, and we will give the details and do it transparently, but that will take time, 6 months, 8 months. It's not going to happen overnight. Meanwhile, what's your advice? How do I get private consumption to improve? How do I get private investors to want to put money in? What would be the 3, 4 top things you'd suggest?
Well, I mean, these are not questions addressed to me by the Prime Minister, but you've addressed them. So let me answer them as questions that I would respond to you. First, and this is very important, see, on the consumption side, the people we have to look out for are the ones that are in the lower income groups. And I would say that we already have several programs which support their income levels. I mean, the most well-known is MGNREGA, the employment program. There are social security, other old age pensions, things like that. I think we could have a system where if we recognize that this year growth is not going to be what the budget said it was, and we come up with a more reasonable assessment, whatever it is, and we announce along with that recognizing that we're going to make additional money available for the following 1 or 2 or 3 programs. I'm not in favor of inventing new programs. Everything we know from the past is that new programs take a humongous amount of time to work out. We should look at the ones we have and simply jack up the level of operation. That would take care of a lot of problems. Second, we should take a serious look at the delays in payments of government which are built into the system. Whenever the budget is under threat, the system reacts in order to delay payments because we have a cash flow system of accounting. I think we should recognize that, and by delaying payments to contractors and others, most recently, for example, the Commerce Minister made a very good statement that we're going to accelerate payments of something over 50,000 crores to exporters. This was a no-brainer. This should have been done much earlier. And there are many other such cases where the government could consciously give a signal, doesn't matter if the fiscal deficit goes up, let's pump some money into the economy through these ways. That's my second suggestion. The third is actually that there are many areas of public investment which are actually being done by the different public sector corporations. Certainly the railways is perhaps the best known of them. And there must be some scope for acceleration of investment activity And the railways would then have to borrow. And if that's done through the government, the end result of all these measures is an increase in the fiscal deficit. I would say that given the importance of jacking up demand, both consumer demand at the lower end and investment in infrastructure, we should not mind an increase in the fiscal deficit. I mean, the truth is, if the fiscal deficit was calibrated around an 11.3% growth, and if the growth is actually going to end up being around 8 or a little above 8, the fiscal deficit will be higher, and we should not try to keep it low. We need to remember, by the way, that in the rest of the world, people have done much more through the fiscal route than we have. I mean, our stimulus has been largely through monetary easing. And in our system, given the limited reach of the banks and their own constraints, that doesn't actually produce much of a stimulus. So I think the short answer is jack up all these demands in the system through the fiscal deficit, through a marginal, small increase in the fiscal deficit in the current year. This would be one point. The second point, I think, is that, we need to recognize that if we are to move into a higher growth rate, 7% or so next year, the banking system could end up being one of our biggest constraints, because at the moment, credit is expanding only at about 6% or so in nominal terms, and inflation is going up. We need to know why is it that the public sector banking system is actually stuck for lending. This takes you into the whole realm of banking reform. It's not an easy solution. We've done some obvious things, like we merged a few banks, but that doesn't give anyone the impression that real reform is underway. There's a huge agenda for banking reform. I won't go into that now. But I think if we could take a series of serious steps which would make people realize that, yes, India is finally fixing its banking problem, I think that would change expectations. Lastly, and I mean, this is extremely important, is vaccination. I mean, nothing will change expectations, both domestically and internationally, about India's potential for performance as much as the visible sign of a successful vaccination program. Now, we were late getting off the ground, but I think we should forget the past. The government has set a target that we will do 100% by December 31. It's not clear whether they meant 100% double dose, so let's leave that aside. My view is if we can even get 80% double dose by December 31 and the whole thing completed perhaps by next February, I think internationally people would say, well, that's really something. Even if this vaccination is not 100% effective, etc., we received a lot of very, very negative news coverage during the pandemic. I don't have to go into that.
Can I stop
Other countries, yeah.
There's no chance it would seem today, and I'm emphasizing it would seem today, that we can achieve 80% double vaccination by the end of the year. At the moment, the figure is roughly 18% double vaccinated, somewhere around 58% single vaccinated. So
yes,
if that is a target that's essential, I'm going to miss it.
But we gain by being frank. I mean, if we can't do it, let's be clear. First, let's have a target for double and single vaccination. All I'm saying is if it can't be 80%, I've not done the maths. If it can't be 80%, let's accept that. As of today, we don't even have clarity whether the earlier target has been withdrawn, although it was officially announced. If we can produce a credible set of targets and then unleash an effort that will achieve it, while there will be people criticizing that it's less than what we promised, by the time we've got it done, people will say, that was really quite something. But what I'm saying is,
a lot of what you said hinges upon the government accepting that there is a need to allow the fiscal deficit to rise. And you pointed out, if the fiscal deficit, which is set at roughly 6.1%, was based upon the economy growing at 11 and the economy only grows at 8, therefore the fiscal will rise. Therefore, the government should accept this. But at what level do you think the government should let the fiscal deficit go? How high would be acceptable to someone like you?
The notion of let the fiscal deficit go is too open-ended. What I'm saying is that if we were to do the maximum that is necessary on the health front. If we need more money for vaccinations, let's do that. If we need more money to import vaccines, let's do that. If we need more money to improve the health system, we should certainly do that. We need more money for MGNREGA and some of the social schemes, we should do that. And I don't think all of this will add up to more than maybe 1% of GDP or a little higher than that, including some of the starting of expenditure on investment. I don't think that a deterioration of that order, if it was combined with credible reform steps later, which would bring the economy back up to 7%, would be negatively perceived. I mean, after all, who's setting the standard? Look at what the United States has done.
Absolutely. So you're saying that if the fiscal deficit targeted at 6.1 in the budget were to go up to 7.1 or even 7.5, you would not have any qualms.
I think a fiscal deficit of 7.5% combined with credible reforms for the next 2 or 3 years would be accepted as a reasonable macroeconomic track.
Montek Singh Ahluwalia, thank you very much indeed. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you, Karan.